Welcome back to the New Creation channel. My name is Peter, and today I'm joined by Jake and Christian from the New Creation blog to react to an Aron Ra video. Thanks so much for joining me, guys. Introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm glad to be here. My name is Jake Ramgren, and New Creation blog writer, and excited to see this Aron Ra video.
I'm Christian Ryan, also a regular contributor to the New Creation blog. I'm a geology student, and I've been wanting to dig into some of these Aron Ra videos for a long time, so I'm really excited for this.
The video we're going to be reacting to today is entitled How Zoology Disproves Noah's Flood, and in it, Ra takes us through a dizzying view of the field of zoology and how in so many aspects, it simply destroys the flood narrative. So we're going to review this devastating critique and give you our thoughts on it.
Estimates are that there are roughly 5,000 species of mammals alive today, plus more than 10,000 species of reptiles, not including birds, of which there are another 10,000 species or so. Then there are another 7,600 amphibians, amounting to roughly 33,000 mostly terrestrial tetrapods altogether. That doesn't account for fish or insects with a vast majority of life on Earth, only the relative few that the biblical authors would recognize as having the breath of life. So the fable says that all the animals that had the breath of life would come to Noah to be saved from the flood. Thus, the first thought you might have is that Noah loaded 66,000 individual animals onto a box that couldn't possibly hold them all.
So what Aron Ra is trying to do here, what he's attempting to do is he's taking the biblical claim that two of every kind of animal was on the ark the whole time in order to kind of make sure all the animals survive as a species after the flood. He's assuming first that the animal that the kind in the Bible is referring to species as we define them today. So he's counting up all the species that would have had to go on the ark. He's giving us the benefit of the doubt of like fish species, saying those ones weren't on the ark, but all the ones that would be on the ark, you take two of every single species. And so he's going to count those up and get this astronomically high number and present the case that all of these species could not have fit onto the ark. And surely we can all agree 66,000 species, being two of each species, would be way too much to fit on an ark of any size, let alone the size of dimensions of which we are given in the Bible. So the issue with Aron Ra's argument here is that for a long time now, like quite a while, creationists have not argued that the species level is where the biblical kind kind of intersects. Those aren't the same thing. Species does not equal kind. And creationists have argued this for a long time now. In fact, it's kind of an ongoing project now for creationists today to try and figure out how many created kinds were there, how many kinds would have been on the ark. But we certainly can't use today's taxonomic system of species, genera, phylum, all those things that Carl Linnaeus laid out in the 1700s for us that we've used ever since. We certainly cannot use that system of classification to go back and decide how many created kinds were on the ark. There's no one-to-one comparison there. So this is why creationists have for a long time now tried to figure out what is a created kind, what is a kind that would have been on the ark, and how many of them were there. And most estimates you'll find today from creationists of how many kinds there were would be much, much less than 66,000 and probably could have fit onto the ark as described in the Genesis account.
Yeah, so Ra is basically just straw manning creationists here. He's just coming up with a theory that no modern creationists hold and then destroying it. Basically, all modern creationists accept the idea that species can change over time, and as a result, species can have changed since the time of the flood. In other words, we had a few representative members aboard the ark, and after, in the post-flood era, they were able to diversify into the many different species we see today. So there's certainly no reason to think that there were 66,000 species that needed to be aboard the ark.
Of course, the people who wrote this story weren't thinking globally. They had no idea that Australia or the Americas even existed, so they didn't know about penguins, polar bears, bison, wallabies, or three-toed sloths, which would never have been able to make the trip to Mesopotamia. Many islands have species that exist only there and nowhere else. How would they distribute them back again? How would they get the dragons to Komodo, tortoises to Galapagos, the tuatara back to New Zealand? At the time that this was supposed to have happened, there were still woolly mammoths on an island north of eastern Russia. The people who made up the story didn't know about any of them.
So in this segment, Aron Ra is trying to essentially argue that the modern biogeography, where animals are living today, reflects where they're living before the flood. As such, since all representatives of all kinds of air-breathing land animals needed to be on the ark to survive the flood, these animals would have to migrate to wherever the ark's being built. Aron Ra is arguing it's Mesopotamia in the ancient Near East. And this argument's kind of problematic because that's not what we're arguing. We're not arguing that our modern world is what was destroyed during the flood. The pre-flood world was very different from the way our world exists today. The continents were arranged in a different pattern, and there is no reason to think that this exact same habitats and ecosystems that we see today, for one, existed before the flood, and two, existed in the exact same places before the flood. The flood completely reshaped the Earth's surface. And so many of these, and also many of these animal species that he mentioned didn't even exist at the time. Case in point, he mentioned Komodo dragons and Galapagos tortoises, things like that. These animals adapted after the flood. These are representatives of created kinds that did survive the flood on the ark, and after the flood, they adapted to specific post-flood environments. And that's why they wouldn't have existed before the flood.
This is a just wildly fallacious argument. Aron Ra is combining two different ideas and then putting them together in this hybrid model that nobody is arguing for, right? So young Earth creationists think that the flood happened about 4,000 years ago. Ra thinks that the Earth is ancient, right? Billions of years old. But the problem is he's looking at this whole idea as if creationists are arguing that the flood happened 4,000 years ago on his timeline. And that's not what we're actually arguing. Young Earth creationists argue, I mean, most of us, I think, would probably agree that the flood, post-flood boundary is actually about 65 million years ago on his timeline. So the problem here is we're not all using the same timeline. He has a timeline, we have a timeline, and even though we can be talking about the same date, 4,000 years ago, they don't actually match up because we disagree with the way in which they date things. And as a result, he's basically using an old Earth conception of time to prove that the Earth is old, which is kind of, as I said earlier, a fallacy.
As well as he brings up the distribution of life after the flood issue. And well, as Christian was saying, first, you can't make, that is not a pre-flood world problem. He's presenting the pre-flood world the same as the post-flood world. So you can't really frame that as a problem before the flood, but it is a valid question after the flood. How do you get all these kinds of animals onto all these islands? It's one of the most common questions people ask. And what's fun to answer about this as a creationist is that there's so many possibilities creationists have come up with. If you look back, there's been plenty of postulations, whether there's the brief ice age would have connected a lot of continents with ice. You have land bridges, of course, being talked about often. And most recently, you have the idea that animals and plants have made it onto all these islands on basically vast mounds of vegetation that would have been caught up after the flood and deposited in the oceans. And you can even look now, if you just Google pictures of just the currents in the ocean, you'll see all the way that the currents move. If there were giant kind of floating masses of trees and vegetation floating through the ocean, there would be drop-off points at basically all these major islands where we see lots of the biodiversity. Galapagos Islands, Australia, New Zealand, all these islands are going to get moments where these masses are going to drop off vast amounts of animals and plant life that then can diversify and populate those islands. So there's plenty of good options for creationists to go with, and so Aron Ra should look into those.
And one of the reasons why this seems like a good argument just on the surface, and when you just hear him say it, is that animals have all of these unique specializations depending on where they live, right? So we have polar bears, right? They are clearly adapted to live in a cold environment. And so it's kind of weird for you to think about, polar bears having to live in the Middle East for a time after the flood. But we're not actually arguing that. Young Earth creationists believe that polar bears, once again, are descendants of the bear kind. And so these animals didn't actually gain these unique specializations, which would have made it weird for them to live in the Middle East until they reached their new homes.
One of the species Aron Ra mentions here is the tuatara, and despite its appearance, it's not actually a lizard. It belongs to a different group of reptiles called Rhynchocephalia, and today they only are found on the island of New Zealand. So that kind of raises the question, well, why are they only in New Zealand if the flood happened in the relatively recent past? Well, it kind of helps if you take a closer look at their fossil record. When we look at the fossil record of tuataras, they start showing up in the Mesozoic layers. These were layers that we think were formed during the flood, and we don't see them in New Zealand, actually, up until around Miocene times, which on our time scale is shortly after the flood. So Rhynchocephalians, the group tuataras belong to, actually had an almost cosmopolitan distribution. They were found all over the pre-flood world. And the flood wiped most of them out. However, after the flood, they don't seem to have done so well. And they only really seem to have colonized New Zealand. We have some possible Cenozoic or post-flood tuatara fossils in other locations, but it's kind of hard to tell if they're really from after the flood or from the later stages of the flood, because it's right above that post-flood boundary, assuming the flood ended at the top of the Mesozoic.
The story also says that Noah was supposed to load at least 7 pairs of each of the clean animals, meaning the livestock that they kept to eat. These would be herd animals that chew the cud and have a divided hoof, such as cattle, deer, goats, and sheep. But they also loaded domestic fowl like chickens, geese, ducks, and whatever other birds these people thought were good to eat. They brought at least 7 pairs of each of those, on top of 2 of every other kind of bird. So how many are we up to now? Who knows? The people who made up the story obviously didn't know, so how could we?
This is once again the result of the conflation of the idea of a kind and a species, and these aren't the same. We only had a couple representatives of each kind, and after the flood, the kind could diversify into lots of species. So we don't need all the animals that he has behind him on the ark.
How are they supposed to house walruses and sea turtles that can't be left in the ocean for a year and can't spend a year on a boat either?
Okay, so this segment kind of ticked me off. Okay. First off, sea turtles. Sea turtles spend virtually their entire lives out in the ocean. As soon as they hatch, they head for the ocean, and they don't come back, ever. They don't rest on land at all. The only exception to that is female sea turtles. They will return to the beach where they hatched in order to lay their own eggs, and then they head right back to the ocean. So I'm not sure why Aron Ra thinks it's a problem for sea turtles to spend a year in the ocean in the flood when they spend their whole lives.
What is the issue with having them aboard the ark in the first place either? Because I'm quite certain that sea turtles don't need water. Like, they can live outside of water. It's not like their skin needs to stay moist or something like that.
Yeah.
Pinnipeds, they can also survive just fine outside of water. The only thing is they need to stay hydrated, and so you have to make sure they consume more water, and you also have to make sure that they stay cool. But outside of that, I don't see a problem with pinnipeds being aboard the ark. What do you think, Jake?
We keep them in captivity all the time. And across the world, they're kept in captivity. And another thing to point out is it makes sense to kind of make that small leap and make that assumption that in addition that we've kept all these creatures in captivity, they probably also kept them in some sort of juvenile stage, right? They probably got animals when they were younger and smaller. It makes more sense to keep, baby elephants on board than it does to take 2 adult elephants, especially if you want to have the maximum potential off the ark to repopulate the earth. You want them in a younger life stage, so when they get off the ark, they can reproduce to the maximum potential. So you have juvenile animals that have to be on the ark for approximately a year. that ever since then we've kept in captivity successfully for a long time. Sea turtles, pinnipeds, we keep these in captivity for years on end. They don't need to be free living in the ocean to survive for the amount of time they need to on the Ark.
Yeah.
Everyone was like, how do zoos exist? This next thing is going to be how zoology disproves zoos.
And what were all these things supposed to eat? As we mentioned in the last video, without refrigeration or any means of preservation, it would not have been possible to store enough food just for the livestock, not for a whole year.
So Aron Ra claims that there isn't enough space aboard the Ark to fit all the food for all these different animals. And to pick up on this, he specifically focuses on livestock. He says that there isn't enough space on the Ark just to fit the food for the livestock. And unfortunately, he doesn't really cite any reason why. And creationists have done a lot of work looking into the storage capacity of the Ark, how many animals would have fit aboard the Ark, how much food they would have needed. I actually just picked this up the other day in a used bookstore. This is by John Woodmorath, and he did a detailed study looking at things, and he came up with the number of 1,990 tons of dry food for all of the animals aboard the Ark. So that's not just talking about the hay for the livestock. This number includes like all the meat that the animals are going to eat and any other sorts of food substances that are dry. And he says that all of that could total up to 1,990 tons, which he argues could be stored within 50% of the Ark's capacity if all of that food was in the form of hay, which he's basically making that argument because hay is kind of a lighter material. It's not so dense. And so it's kind of one of the hardest food substances to store in terms of space. So he's pointing out that even if all the food, all the dry food for all the animals was kept in most, porous, least dense form, it still would only take up half the capacity of the Ark. So getting the food just for the livestock is literally not a problem. But the livestock themselves do not disprove anything.
And there's a lot of ways to condense food to keep it in like a really tight package, right? So
yeah,
yeah, you could you could take fresh vegetation like leaves and grass and kind of mash them and compress them into pellets, kind of like energy bars. They take a lot of that nutrients and just crunch it into a smaller chunk.
Not to mention meat preservation.
It goes
from ancient time in terms of using salt in
Yeah.
barrels. People have spent years out at sea, and they have plenty of food on much smaller ships than the Ark would have been. Plenty of space. Just put some meat in a barrel, cover it with salt, and it's preserved for a long time. They've been doing it since ancient Egypt.
Yeah. And you can preserve fruits with honey, jams, jellies, and syrups. And there's also certain tubers and gourds that can remain fresh for an entire year if they're left, hanging if they're hanging suspended in the air.
And there wasn't much thought given to the wild animals either. How do you feed them? What are koalas and anteaters and bats and earthworms supposed to eat?
So in this segment, Aron Ra is pointing to animals with specialized diets to kind of point to a difficulty that Noah would have had to deal with, supposedly, because we're told in scripture that Noah had to gather all of the food that he, his family, and the animals would eat. And obviously, if we look around the world today, there are plenty of animals with very specialized diets. In this video, Aron Ra mentions koalas and anteaters. I'll talk about koalas first, because those are actually really interesting. As we all know today, koalas almost exclusively eat eucalyptus leaves. But if we turn to the fossil record, that wasn't always the case. If we mentioned before that we think the flood probably ended around the end of the Mesozoic. So right at the top of the Mesozoic layers, that's when post-flood sediment layers and the fossil record starts. And when we look in these post-flood fossil-bearing strata, the earliest koalas we find are actually not specialized for eating eucalyptus. Modern koalas, they have specialized adaptations in their skulls and teeth that allow them to eat eucalyptus. However, there's various species of fossil koalas, like Nimio koala, little koala, and Peri koala. And from studying the plant fossils we find alongside these fossil koalas, we can tell that these animals lived in rainforests, and they ate a variety of different types of leaves. However, after the flood, we see a trend in the climate where it starts off really warm and wet, which makes sense. The flood was probably the wettest period in Earth history, as paleontologist Kurt Wise likes to say. And after the flood, things dried out over the hundreds of years and millennia that passed. And in Australia, we start to see these rainforests disappear, and the trees that lived in those rainforests are replaced by hardier plants that thrive in arid environments, like eucalyptus trees. So these koalas, the modern koalas, actually branched off from the main koala lineage and specialized to eat eucalyptus leaves in order to survive in this drying environment. So Noah would not have needed to worry about collecting eucalyptus leaves because the koalas before the flood probably were not specialized to eat that food. And Aron Ra also mentioned anteaters. That's also a really interesting story when you look at the fossil record. Once again, we can look at the fossil record to kind of get an idea of what's going on with them, but it's not quite as clear because the fossil record of anteaters is kind of scant early after the flood. We don't really start to see their fossils until the Miocene, which, according to our timeline, it's a little bit after the flood. We don't have any anteaters from right after the flood. So this is actually kind of a problem for the evolutionists as well, because they would argue that anteaters evolved from the same common ancestor as sloths around 55 million years ago. But we don't have any evidence of that fossil transition. Anteaters pretty much just show up in the Miocene, which doesn't really work with their model because they would argue, they came from a less specialized ancestor. So this is kind of an open question for creationists and evolutionists. We need a more complete anteater fossil to kind of be able to tell exactly what's going on. My suspicion is that right after the flood, anteaters also had a broader diet, kind of like I mentioned with koalas. And then over time, they adapted to specialize in eating colony living insects like ants and termites.
And the most kind of ironic thing here is that in the modern world, when we keep anteaters in zoos, we don't even need to feed them ants. Like, they don't raise like thousands and thousands of ants to feed an anteater. You know how many ants you would have to like constantly be raising if in a zoo where you have multiple anteaters, that was all you fed them? In zoos, they literally feed them like a sort of kibble that is made out of like eggs and fruits and other things like that. So it's not even necessary to give them ants. And that's kind of a common element. A lot of these creatures with very specialized diets in the modern world don't actually rely on them. And we know that because we raise them in captivity, which Aron Ra is again overlooking how we literally raise animals in the modern world.
What about the termites? They're the only ones with abundant food, but they're not allowed to eat it. Well, parasites had plenty of food too, didn't they? Do you think these animals accidentally carried on only one male and one female of each species of fleas, ticks, lice, mites, mosquitoes, and intestinal worms? You think maybe God could have not given them a ticket to board? How can you have just one male and one female termite? Or just two of every species of ant or bee? That just doesn't work. That's why Answers in Genesis ignores the insects, saying that they didn't have to be saved on the ark because they didn't have lungs. But they still breathe, and they'll drown, and we still have them. So if this fable was true, then how did they make it?
So did insects need to be aboard the ark? You got a lot of species there. Insects are kind of one of the most diverse groups of organisms. So if you have to have insects aboard the ark, that's a pretty major consideration. But it doesn't appear to me that insects really needed to be aboard the ark. They don't appear to have the breath of life in the way that animals do. they don't actively, breathe. They don't have lungs. They just have little holes called spiracles, and they basically absorb the air. And they don't have blood either. And that is also a kind of biblical part of the definition of life. So for those reasons, I don't think insects needed to be aboard the ark. But when would they survive?
I think there's a couple different ways they could do that. One of which is on floating vegetation mats. We'd mentioned earlier in this video that the flood wiped out a lot of trees. And while some of those trees and other plants would have sunk and become buried and fossilized or simply just rotted, many of them were left floating on the ocean surface. And as the currents moved them around, they kind of accumulated in these large vegetative mats. So any of these insects and other non-breathing animals like spiders and scorpions, they could actually float on these throughout most of the flood. And I think it's also important to reemphasize that the entire world was not covered by floodwaters for the entire year. So they wouldn't necessarily have to live on these vegetative mats for that whole length of time, just the period of time when the whole world is covered by water. Otherwise, they could find exposed land surfaces to spend the rest of the flood on.
You could argue they had it better than the animals on the ark.
Yes.
They had whole large trees all to themselves.
Yes. And I think this also helped in post-flood recovery, because as we all know, many of our invertebrates are really important for kind of establishing ecosystems after natural disasters. Worms will kind of mix sediment, they'll mix the nutrients in the sediment around that'll help plants grow. Many insects are pollinators, so as new plant life is starting to grow, it needs to get pollinated. And all of that could have been happening before the animals even get off the ark.
Yeah, and you'll find in literature we've observed insects and really all invertebrates in arthropods. They diversify very, very quickly, much quicker than vertebrates do. You'll find lots of that. And in fact, just quickly to give an example, that our earthworms we have here are an invasive species. So you can see they are, basically across all of North America, it's earthworms, and they do great things for the soil, but they're not native to our area. So you can see invertebrates diversifying across vast amounts of land much faster than you would think, which, like you said, Christian, prepares life for the vertebrates to come in. You already have ecosystems forming, not just with land, but also with the invertebrate life for the animals, with the breath of life, with blood, before those animals actually get there to populate and repopulate the earth.
So if insects could survive the flood like that, I think that means that we could have a lot of genetic diversity cross that flood boundary as well, right? So that can also aid in the diversification of insects post-flood.
And what about the predators? A single lion eats 10 pounds of meat a day. So for every individual carnivore of that size, you'd need to load another large 3,600-pound bovine just to last 1 year. Once you've got a few lions and hyenas, wolves and bears and other such things on board, there go all your clean animals. They'll have to share one cow every day with another waiting in line to be killed tomorrow. Even with just a few large predators, it would still take a herd of hundreds of cattle to last 1 year.
So here Aron Ra is arguing essentially that in order to support all of these carnivorous animals on an ark for a full year, you would need an entire herd of cattle or other livestock in order to keep them fed. Once again, he is conflating species with kinds. So not every species needs to be on the ark. And also, you don't need to take the biggest members of every species either. When we look in the earliest post-flood rock layers and we look at the types of animals we find there that are representatives of these kinds, we find that they tend to be smaller, actually, than many of their modern descendants. So, for example, the earliest cats are animals like Proaelurus. It's about the size of a house cat. The earliest members of the dog kind, like Hesperocyon, about the size of a fox. And even the bears, we see this. Ursavis is one of the earliest types of bears that we find in the fossil record, and it's about the size of a wolverine. So these animals aren't going to need vast amounts of meat that Aron Ra is trying to postulate here.
furthermore, he overlooks like the entire possibility that they weren't given fresh meat. Like, you could have just given them dried meat. That's another thing that kind of Woodmorap picked up on in this book. He discusses the possibility that Noah could have given them dried meat, and he mentions that salt might have been something that at least some animals might not want to eat meat that has so much salt in it. But he mentions that there are alternative ways of preserving meat that don't require salt. So I think you're right. You don't need such large animals. You can get smaller animals, but for some, you might not have even needed living flesh either.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're wondering if zoos feed lions by just throwing in one entire cow per lion per day, that's not how they do things.
It's not.
No, it's not a 1-to-1. One cow for you, one cow for you. No, not exactly. And another thing to mention is in captivity. What's interesting when we look at how much each animal eats, it's often somewhat proportional to not just the size of the animal or what the animal's diet is, but also how much energy they expend. So if an animal has to hunt for a lion, or if a lion has to hunt for an animal, it's going to need a lot more sustenance once it actually does catch and eat one. But if you have, say, a short period of time, relatively like a 1-year period of time where now the lion does not have to hunt, does not have to go out and find a mate, does not have to expend all this energy, it's not going to require as much meat as lions do today. We look at them on a daily basis and say, this is how much it needs. Well, it needs that much meat because it's also working off that much energy on a day-to-day basis. So it will need to be fed, but it's not going to need quite the extensive amount of work that Aron Ra is assuming it does. And we can see this again by looking at how they're kept in captivity today.
I think the point of this whole video now is basically just that Aron Ra needs to go visit a zoo.
He just hasn't been since he was a little kid. He needs to reinvigorate that childhood wonder and walk through a zoo or two.
And even if you could keep all the predators fed for the duration of the deluge, they'd eat up all the prey in the first month back on shore. There's just no way any of this works.
So here, Aron Ra's kind of making an argument that a lot of people have thought about when all the animals get off the ark. Well, what do they eat now? All the animals that haven't been on the ark have been wiped out. So a couple points can be made here. I'll just make one or two of them. First, when animals get off the ark, a lot more of those animals are going to be omnivorous than we think. We look at animals today and see that lions, they eat pretty much always meat because there's so much meat in abundance. What you don't see is that if there was less meat in abundance, a lot of animals, a lot more than we think, actually do adapt their diets into a more omnivorous diet. And especially Aron Ra mentioned bears in there, and bears are one of the most omnivorous creatures we know of. I mean, we think of them as meat eaters, but they spend a lot of their time eating berries, eating fruits, eating vegetation, eating insects. So a lot of these animals are going to be able to eat things a wider variety than meat.
And to go back to the previous point I made, many of these early post-flood animals were quite small, so they wouldn't need as much food to survive. And you can also factor in the reproduction rates of a lot of these smaller animals. Small animals breed much faster than large ones. Think of all the mice and rats and how quickly they breed, and rabbits too. Like, there would be many of these small animals running around very shortly after the flood, and they might have even been reproducing on the ark. So you'd have more of them coming off the ark than they went in.
Yeah. The funniest thing to me here is that he basically overlooks the whole point that lots of different animal kinds did go extinct immediately following the flood, right? He just basically overlooks the point that, okay, if we had dinosaurs aboard the ark, basically all non-avian dinosaur kinds went extinct, along with some avian kinds as well. Not to mention there were lots of different kinds of mammals and mammal-like reptiles that all went extinct as well. So he's saying that if this is true, lots of animals will go extinct. Well, they did. So maybe that's where the food came from. Maybe some of these animal kinds were brought aboard the ark, not so that they could repopulate the earth, but so that after the flood, they could serve as food for the kinds that God did want to survive.
Yeah, and you would think of that indiscriminately as well. You think of Noah as just taking, a small portion of the world's life and preserving it, but then once it's released back outside of the ark, kind of the nature red in tooth and claw kind of takes over again, and you have kind of the same systems that were happening before they all got on the ark happening afterwards, and indiscriminately some kinds are not going to make it.
If you see this as a provincial legend about a localized flood, then the proportions are not so absurd. But creationists tend to demand a worldwide flood with every species from every continent till the story no longer floats. Young Earth creationists go even further and throw dinosaurs in there too, along with every other terrestrial animal in the fossil record. They don't know what that means. It's not just that a couple of sauropods would have been too big for the ark all by themselves. It's that there are hundreds of species of dinosaurs and thousands more species of mammal-like reptiles, giant anapsids, terror birds, and several enormous ancient mammals which these religious extremists don't know anything at all about.
Well, we're all getting an education today. We didn't know that any of those animals even existed. Open your eyes.
Oh man, I'm exposed.
Christian mentioned earlier that one of the most ironic parts about this is that some of the animals pictured here are actually on the Answers in Genesis Ark Encounter replica.
Yeah.
So not only are creationists aware of these, they literally put them on the ark.
Since young Earth creationists reject the entirety of geologic history, they're determined to make believe that everything was magically created all at once and that dinosaurs lived alongside people, at least in the Bible times. They're also determined to distort the Bible into mentioning dinosaurs. For example, the book of Job mentions Leviathan, Behemoth, and the unicorn. I know. The traditional joke is that the unicorn didn't make it on the ark, and that's why we don't have any today. But back in the Bronze Age, people had a very different idea of what a unicorn was. The Latin name of this animal is Diceros bicornis, and this one is called Rhinoceros unicornis. This is a unicorn. And bearing this in mind, read Job 39 again in the King James Bible. It makes a lot more sense when you see it as this instead of this. Likewise, the next chapter describes Behemoth as an elephant whose tail bends or sways like a Middle Eastern cedar. It does not describe the size of the tail, nor in any way imply that it should look like a North American cedar, nor could the authors have even thought that. Instead, they said that the sinews of his stones are wrapped together and his nose pierces snares. Or in other translations, they're trying to snare his nose. For these and other reasons, we know that this is an elephant. These traits are unique to elephants, and this is not the way anyone would describe a sauropod. But young Earth creationists insist on lying about that so they can try to make this into a dinosaur.
So Aron confidently asserts to us that the behemoth is actually just an elephant. And one of the kind of pieces of evidence that he raises for this idea is that there's some mention of people trying to catch or wrangle this animal by grabbing its nose with hooks. I don't think, though, that that really is necessarily tying it to being an elephant. I mean, that seems to me actually to be one of the worst ways to capture an elephant, to grab its trunk.
Yeah.
Like when we think of getting animals like on a nose ring or something like that, you're usually talking about like animals that have a short muzzle, like an ox or something like that, where you can actually have a nice nose where you can actually kind of grab onto it more. So an elephant nose seems the last thing that you would try to grab onto if you were trying to get an elephant. But furthermore, I think he has a decent point about this not clearly being a sauropod. Lots of creationists argue that this is definitely a sauropod. Now, I'm not contesting this. This could be a description of a dinosaur, but I think he's right that if you were going to describe a sauropod to someone, you would have some details that aren't present in the text. For example, the neck, right? That's something that is just completely absent from the text, any mention of a really long neck. Yet if you were trying to describe a sauropod, that's actually one of the first things you would pick up on. So I think it's incorrect to prominently, claim that this is definitely a sauropod, but I don't think it's an elephant either.
But let's imagine for a moment that every species that ever lived was alive at the same time. There are so many genera evident in the fossil record that what we have left today represent only about 1% of everything that has ever lived. Thus, an already exaggerated tall tale goes from overloaded to overbloated and collapses under the weight of its own impossibility. Noah would need a fleet of arks that size, a whole navy.
I'm really curious where he thinks this estimate's coming from. He doesn't cite any sources, and I would love for him to actually, present these 99% of all species that are extinct, because I couldn't find them in my research. So I went to the Catalog of Life, which is an online database that provides an index of all species we know, whether they're extinct or they're still alive today. And the exact number changes from year to year, because sometimes we'll lump a couple species together, or we'll split a species apart into two or more species. And the current estimates for the year 2024, I found just the other day, there are 2.1 million species that we're comfortable with saying are, their own species. Of those, there are 2.03 still alive, so these are extant living species, and just 140,000 are extinct. So the math's not really coming up, right?
Yeah, I mean, this whole idea that we only have a tiny, tiny fraction of what life once existed is based on, once again, these evolutionary presuppositions, right? This is another example of him forcing us to take on an aspect of his model. So once again, this idea that 99% of all species that ever lived went extinct is based on the idea of how fast evolution occurs, how many billions of years the Earth has been around. All of that is going into this calculation. And we don't agree with any of that. So no, we don't have to deal with this idea that another, 99% of animals would have been aboard Noah's Ark.
Not everything had to be on the ark, because a lot of these were seagoing creatures. But then what happened to all the ammonites and trilobites, pliosaurs, plesiosaurs, ichthyosaurs, mosasaurs, placodonts, crinoids, eurypterids, and other things that are now entirely extinct? If God wanted to save any of these species, he certainly went about it the wrong way, didn't he?
So I guess God's point in making an ark was not to save the trilobites. I mean, he's asking what happened to these? Well, we find their fossils buried in rock layers, so they died in the flood. I'm not sure what else you want us to tell you.
Yeah, the whole point of the ark was to preserve air-breathing land creatures. Extinction is not diagnostic to the flood anyway. It's ultimately a result of Adam and Eve's sin, which brought death and animal suffering into the world. That's why we have extinction. It's not the flood. The flood did happen, yes, and it did wipe out a lot of species, but ultimately extinction is tied to the fall, the fact that we live in a fallen world.
Yeah, that's a huge key, Christian, right there, is that when you can't point to bad things happening during the flood and saying, oh, this species went extinct, or oh, this horrible thing happened, as an argument against the flood. The flood was meant to be a horrible thing, right? That's what you have to remember. That's when kind of the theology comes into it too. Like we can't just look at the flood through a scientific lens. You also have to keep in mind what is happening in the story of the Old Testament. And this is God wiping out virtually all of humanity for the sins that they have committed against him. So when horrible things happen and species go extinct, that's not something that's contradicting the flood. That's something that the flood is causing. And it's part of God's plan, and it's part of his punishment. And it factors into the rest of the Old Testament narrative because that's the point of the flood. That's the context that it goes into in the Old Testament scripture.
When Answers in Genesis built their fake ark in Kentucky, they quickly realized that they couldn't even house a decent zoo in that boat-shaped building. Not without extensive and expensive provisions, more than any crew of 8 could have possibly managed or stored, even with modern appliances. And without air conditioning and much more ventilation than their fable allowed, everyone would have died of methane poisoning within the first couple of days. So, instead of including a zoo with real animals, which would have been a much better attraction, they opted to create a few dozen stuffed animals instead, which really wasn't worth the ticket price.
So why didn't Answers in Genesis put their little Ararat Ridge Zoo inside the ark? Well, I think there's a couple of reasons why, and presumably it's because they're not actually trying to save the animals from a worldwide flood, so they'd like them to have comfortable quarters and not just get them aboard in case they doom the entire species to extinction. I'm presuming that, living aboard the Ark wasn't the nicest thing for the animals. They had to be shut in away from the outside. They couldn't have, as much fresh air and as they would have liked, and maybe as much space as they would have liked. So obviously, we're not going to have animal abuse and shut them up in tiny quarters today for no reason. There's just simply no reason to put live animals and stuff them aboard the Ark, as there was in the days of Noah, because there was literally no other way for them to survive the flood. So,
I also find it interesting. He says that the Ark wouldn't have had ventilation, but there were openings in the Ark, and methane floats, so it would just go up and out of the openings, I would imagine.
I'd also like to point out that the Answers in Genesis Ark is a museum. It's also meant to convey information. You need people going in and out of it, people walking around it, going to all the exhibits. So it would be counterintuitive to actually make it as zoo-like as possible if what you're trying to do is make a museum.
Yeah, I mean, and furthermore, the whole point is that the living species of animals would not have been aboard the Ark, right? So why, if that was the case, would we put living species of animals on the Ark? And we're saying that's not what it was like. So that's obviously why they have, as he calls them, stuffed animals on the Ark.
These included a pair of dromaeosaurs, but without any feathers, of course, because they don't want people to know that dinosaurs were so bird-like.
I'd like to point out that Deinonychus he pointed to is not a Deinonychus.
What is it?
It's a juvenile Tyrannosaurus.
Oh.
Deinonychus is a close relative of Velociraptor, so it should have longer arms and it should have the little toe claws. That model has tiny arms because it's a T-Rex.
Okay.
So it's and this is a guy
finds at the Ark properly.
Yeah. And Aron Ra supposedly has had some actual paleontology experience, so you would think he'd be able to tell a Deinonychus apart from a T-Rex. You'd think.
Being forced to defend an increasingly obviously indefensible myth, young Earth creationists painted themselves into a corner and used an unlikely excuse as their only escape. They realized that evolution was the only explanation they could use to reconcile all these impossibilities. The fact that finally clued Darwin to the idea that one species could diversify into many was the discovery of a collection of finches from the Galapagos archipelago. All the island birds were derivations of a common ancestor on the mainland. So if you only had that archetype, then that one species is as good as the 14 that evolved from it. So AIG said that they didn't need tens of thousands of species on their ark, just a few common ancestors from which they could derive everything else.
So Ra suggests that creationists were faced with the task of building the Ark encounter. And with this momentous building project ahead of them, they decided that they suddenly realized for the first time they couldn't fit the animals that they needed to all aboard the Ark. And therefore, they suddenly came up with the idea that animals could change over time. Now, what he fails to mention is that creationists already believed this at the time of Linnaeus, which was before Darwin. Linnaeus, later in life, came to accept the view that species did change over time. So creationists believed this long before they were considering how many animals to put aboard the Ark encounter.
Yeah, this whole idea of created kinds, even though the term created kinds is new, actually came about well before we knew that there were millions of species. So it actually had the opposite problem. As people were trying to figure out how many animals were on the Ark, they realized that a lot of the species that they knew about were really, really similar to each other. And they're like, are we sure these are different kinds? One really good example are the various species of bovids. So, you have your domestic cows, your cebus, your African buffaloes, your American bison, your Eurasian bison. A lot of those early naturalists realized that those similarities were very apparent, and they were kind of leaning toward the idea that they actually came from the same pair of critters on the Ark.
Mm-hmm. And the early naturalists also kind of didn't know exactly how variation happened in a population over time, but some of them believed that it came about through hybridization, which is why you have, like, for example, the giraffe. The scientific name for the giraffe is Giraffa camelopardalis, because they thought it was a hybrid between a camel and a leopard. So, people were considering that species could change over time. They just didn't really have a very clear mechanism of how.
Creationists don't believe in gradual evolution over millions of years, but they'll evoke a super fast, hyper-accelerated evolution happening in only a century or so if they need that type of excuse.
Yes, so it's interesting. He contrasts the slow and gradual evolutionary process that he believes in, and says that the creationists kind of invented a super fast version of evolution. Like you said, he's almost implying that they did it while they were building the ark. That, like, mid-construction, they went, "Oh, we don't have enough space, so let's take some of the evolution stuff and say it happened really, really quickly." 2 points to make there is that, one, creationists, like you said, have argued that for a long time. And the second point is that in a lot of the secular literature, when you look it up, and you can just Google these things, they actually have terms: adaptive radiation, rapid speciation, and all these things out there you can look at of examples of creatures adapting to an environment very, very quickly, or maybe in a response to environmental pressures or something like that. And so you'll find that even if you look up evidence for evolution, what you'll find is a lot of things happening very, very quickly. And you'll even find articles saying this happened in 10, 20 years, like in decades instead of in thousands of years or millions of years. So he's contrasting slow evolution, which they do believe in. They have to believe in a slow, gradual evolution, but he's contrasting it with a speedy evolution that creationists believe in, when in actuality you can look at a lot of the evolutionary literature and they actually say this species changing is happening very, very quickly, and it's observable, and it's quick, and it's always because of a new environment opening up, or it's a response to environmental pressure as response to a prey species. It's always because of something in the environment that's causing them to change very, very quickly. And they'll use it as evidence for evolution, but it's happening really, really quickly. It's not the slow, gradual evolution that Darwin talks about, or that Aron Ra is talking about.
Yeah, this would have definitely been a factor after the flood, because the flood itself wiped out every ecosystem on the planet. And that left a bunch of new niches open. And for a while after the flood, centuries or millennia, the climate, as I mentioned earlier, was changing. So you had the really hot, wet climate at the start of the post-flood era, and it dried out. Well, you're going to have intermediate environments as the years go on. So not only are animals and plants adapting to those new niches that were opened right at the end of the flood, but also new environments as they're emerging and being replaced by other ones.
Very observable too. Even creationists love to bring up Mount St. Helens because the geological and all that stuff is great. But if you take a zoological approach to that, and you look at the animals in the area, there are plenty of deer that were living in that area. When Mount St. Helens happened and it wiped out this massive ecosystem, if you look at how quickly the deer repopulated that area, it was extremely fast. It was back up to the numbers beforehand within just a couple of generations. So it was extremely quick, the repopulation that happened. So again, you look at things happening quickly today. Imagine if there was minimal competition, there was no humans, or there were very, very few humans around, and you just kind of take all those factors into account. The adaptation and speciation that's happening, it's very easy to think of it happening way, way faster than evolutionists would anticipate.
Now, he's right to kind of say that creationists are arguing that speciation is happening at a faster rate than evolutionists typically consider it to happen. Because even when we look at kind of the modern sorts of diversifications that occur, they even are somewhat limited compared to what we need to have happened in the fossil record when we look at the members of a kind that are all related. But there's various theories that have been put forth by creationists to kind of explain that. Now, we don't really have the full answers to exactly how this happened, but it seems that a lot of the genetic material that is termed junk DNA in modern organisms' genomes actually probably once had a functional role and was related to this rapid diversification, and over time basically lost its function as a result of mutations that accumulated. So this is an area where creationists have to do more work, but there is evidence that organisms did rapidly speciate.
So how many cats were on the ark? Now, surely they didn't have every species of cat known to man, not when they're all the same kind. Why would you have 2 felines and 2 panthers and 2 scimitar cats when you could derive all 3 groups just from one breeding pair of proto-kitties, like a pair of prehistoric nymphorids, for example? These are a group of almost cats from the Eocene epoch. How long would it take on a young Earth creationist timescale for these to evolve into all the cats we have today? Well, there's a problem with that. Answers in Genesis said the flood happened less than 4,400 years ago, but we already had depictions of both lions and leopards with different kinds of house cats long before then. So each of these species already existed before the flood that never happened.
It sure was nice of those cave painters to leave the year right next to the artwork of when they created that.
I was dumbfounded watching that for the first time, watching that this part. I was like, oh no.
This is just such a consistent thread, not only through this video, but through every single video in this series. He is constantly conflating his time scale with our time scale. And I just don't understand how he doesn't realize that.
If we believed that ancient Egypt basically was this big empire with these massive cat statues and sphinxes, and he believed all of that we accepted that there are dates on that, I mean, he might as well, like, I don't understand why he's not arguing that humans have been around for much longer than 6,000 years. And like, I'm sure he argues that elsewhere, but the fact that he
has
that
a video called
he
has a video called How Anthropology Disproves Noah's Flood, and his big point in that is basically that there are human fossils that are dated older than 4,000 years.
Right. That's essentially, he just keeps making the argument that the timescales don't match conventional timescales.
Like,
as if we're arguing that they do.
Who'd have thunk?
His argument for his side is that we disagree on something. Like, that's why we're having the argument. We knew we disagreed on this already. You don't have to point that out.
That's the whole point.
This series could basically have just been one video. It could have just been how dating disproves Noah's flood, because that's basically what this boils down to.
Yeah. Your theory doesn't fit my theory, so it's wrong.
Pakicetus is taxonomically basal to the entire ancestry of whales. But if you're going to allow evolution to derive all these descendants and whales could have been left in the ocean, then why would you include a whale ancestor on the ark? Oh, yeah, because the magic book of fables says that whales were created as they are on the 5th day.
So, Pakicetus on the ark encounter, what's the deal with that? Well, there's actually a number of different positions amongst young Earth creationists on whales. Do all whales belong to the same created kind? Is Pakicetus a member of the whale created kind, or are there multiple created kinds? And Aron Ra mentions the passage in Genesis chapter 1 that specifically refers to whales as our kind of proof text that God must have made fully aquatic whales. That's actually not what the text says. If you look at the original Hebrew word there, it's tanin, and this word has been a nightmare to translate from the Hebrew. The actual word that's used in translations can vary from translation to translation. Sometimes even in the same translation. For example, in the King James Bible, in Genesis 1, tanin is translated as whales. Elsewhere, it's translated as dragons. And if you look at other Bible translations, it's translated as jackals. Sometimes it's translated as reptiles, as in the case of the Septuagint. So we really don't know what this word means. It's not specifically referring to whales, as far as we can tell.
It's just like great sea creatures is kind of
yes,
yeah,
exactly. And to get back to the discussion of whale-created kinds, there has been some baraminological research, or the study of created kinds. There's been some research on whales, the various types of whales, both living and extinct. And it seems to suggest that there are different created kinds of whales. There is at least one created kind of baleen whale. There seem to be three or four kinds of toothed whales, and the archaeocetes. These are the ancient whales to which animals like Pachycetus and Basilosaurus and Dorodon and other animals I'm not supposed to know about because I'm a creationist, they probably seem to belong to a single created kind as well.
But then, why did they have Mesohippus, an intermediate stage in the evolution of horses? Why not derive all horses starting from the beginning with Eohippus or Hyracotherium? In fact, if you went just a bit further, you could have had Cambatherium, a taxonomic precursor of horses, rhinos, and Chalicotheres. So why did they have all three of those on the Ark encounter? Oh yeah, because their rhino cage was labeled unicorn. They had to do that in order to lend some credence to the fable.
This to me is just such a random, pointless comment. Like literally earlier, he was talking about how unicorn meant rhino. And then for some reason, he gets all bothered when Answers in Genesis makes the exact same point. Like, what? This man.
You cannot please Aron Ra unless you agree with him 110%.
Well, even when you do, we agree with him 100% about the rhino.
Yes.
He still gets mad. For putting on the Ark, I guess.
Yeah. But in any case, all of those references to unicorns are post-flood anyway in Scripture. So...
Intriguing.
Yeah.
But the idea was that they could stock the boat with just a few basal precursors that could later branch into all the modern varieties. Well, except for dinosaurs, of course. They had already diversified into hundreds of species, and all of them became extinct immediately as soon as they stepped off the boat, along with more than 90% of everything else that ever lived. How's that for divine guidance? I know the Lord works in delirious ways, but having a shipment where almost everything is dead upon arrival is not survival.
I love how this just directly contradicts what he was saying earlier. Earlier, he was like, well, if you had all these animals aboard the Ark, so many of them would die right after the Ark. And now he's like, oh, and why are all these animals dying right after the flood? Please have some self-awareness.
Yeah. Admittedly, it's a little hard to imagine what the use would be to preserve two of a kind onto an Ark for plenty of those kinds to go extinct immediately afterwards. But again, it's a lot of our presuppositions on what the Ark was for, right? We kind of assume it's for everything to survive, it's to preserve everything. And it's certainly meant to keep the human lineage going, especially, but he wants animals to survive. But if creatures go extinct as a result of these events, and again, I don't think God is like targeting dinosaurs or targeting any creature for extinction. He's sovereign and he's in control. But I tend to imagine this as I kind of mentioned earlier, he's preserving life, but once it's released back into creation, all the natural laws that were in place beforehand of natural selection, all that kind of takes over again. And so if creatures become extinct as a result of that, it's not really God's fault. It's, again, all of this is in response to the sin of humankind. It doesn't surprise me that it's hard to follow for an evolutionist, especially one who isn't, I wouldn't consider Aron Ra an expert on biblical theology.
Really?
But once you bring the theology into it, it's not, you can't blame God for letting creatures go extinct. He's preserved them all on an ark. He's put out all these provisions for them. And if some of them go extinct again, it just goes back to punishment for mankind's sin, and that other creatures have to bear the punishment for how evil mankind was, because we were the ones who had dominion. We were the ones who had control and were supposed to be the image bearers of God. And when we mess up that badly, it's, as we see throughout all of Scripture, when humans mess up that badly, it doesn't just affect us, it's going to affect creation too. It goes all the way back to the fall. So this is where you get a little theological. It doesn't surprise me that it's confusing for some evolutionists, but it's not something we don't have answers for.
And creationists don't have a problem with microevolution, that's variation within species, but they're forbidden to admit macroevolution, which is variation between species, evolution at or above the species level.
Generally, this is just a semantic argument, both from Aron Ra and from the creationist position here. So generally, microevolution is described as variation within a species. And then macroevolution is the generation of a new species or evolution into higher taxonomic ranks. Now, creationists sometimes adopt this, and what they say is microevolution is variation within a kind. So they change species to kind. But I think that's a somewhat confusing point to be made, and it implies that we are species fixists, such that we believe species are just really large but don't change. So I think it's bad terminology all around. We should just say macroevolution exists and macroevolution happens within kinds.
So they used to say that speciation was impossible until they found out that it has actually happened a bunch of times. So they moved the goalposts such that the evolution of a new species of finch are just changes within a kind. By mislabeling and misappropriating evolution in this way, Answers in Genesis figured they could generate every species alive today out of only 1,400 original archetypes on the ark, which they consider to be specially or magically created kinds. The Bible never says what a kind is. It says there are many different kinds of all sorts of birds, but it doesn't say what a sort is either, nor why there are different kinds within a kind. Why aren't they all the bird kind?
So does the Bible have a dictionary entrance for the definition of a kind? No, it doesn't. It turns out the Bible doesn't have a dictionary attached at all. But we can gather the clues about what is meant by these sorts of words from the context. The kinds that we're talking about here are used in two contexts. One is the original creation of the kinds, and then it's used again in the description of the ark. So I'll just comment on the kinds mentioned in the ark, since we're kind of talking about Noah's flood right now. In that context, kind is clearly referring to a reproductive group. In the scripture, the Bible clearly says that the point of bringing two members of each kind is to preserve them. So the idea is that you need a male and a female so that they can mate and have offspring. So if kinds were not reproductively isolated from one another, you wouldn't need both a male and a female of each kind, right? So here, the idea of a kind is clearly tied to reproductive compatibility in this context. And from other passages of scripture, we get the idea of kinds being separate morphologically as well and distinct from one another.
Otherwise, everything is either cattle or beasts or sea monsters or creeping things. The people who cobbled together the Bible had no idea how to classify anything. They define things by what they do rather than what they are.
I actually agree with them on that point. I mean, not that the people who cobbled together the Bible, obviously that's not the right phraseology. But yeah, I would say they were classified on what they do. I would say what God, and you have to remember, Genesis is not just something people cobbled together. It's just God speaking to Moses and Moses writing it down, right? And the way God framed all the creatures, he described them by what they did. That's just one way for people to understand. And it's not going to be super easy to sort things into those groups, just like it's not easy for us to sort into groups what things are, right? It's always going to be a little more complicated. But for simplicity's sake, when God created everything in the beginning of Genesis, when he described everything getting onto the ark, he described what they did as just a means of describing all the creatures that were on the ark. It's just the way that God broke it down. So again, I disagree that random people cobbled together all of this as a classification system. People didn't have official classification systems until centuries after this. But this is just the way God described the living things to Moses when Moses is writing down his words in the book of Genesis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is kind of just another instance of chronological snobbery because the biblical writers aren't using Aron Ra's preferred method of classification. They must be primitive and inferior. But they didn't need our modern scientific classification schemes because they weren't writing about natural histories of all these various living things. They're just describing historical events that were happening. And when we needed more sophisticated taxonomic ranks, we invented them.
Creationists did too.
Yes, yes, yes.
And what I find most funny here is that he basically overlooks the whole context as well. Why in Genesis is God talking about what animals do? Well, it's because he created them in functional groups at particular times, right? So if we think about, for example, the creation of plants, God makes the dry land, then he makes the plants that are going to inhabit it. Or God separates the land from the water, and then there's a whole day in which he spends filling the oceans, right? So Genesis 1 is designed around this idea that God successively filled each of these different ecological spaces that he created. And that is inherently tied to the locomotory mode that each of these different groups of animals uses.
And we kind of do a similar thing today, even with scientific classification existing. For example, we could point to fruits and vegetables. Cucumbers and tomatoes are biologically, they're fruit, but when we're in the kitchen and we're cooking with them, we call them vegetables. It's not because, we're not trying to describe what they are, we're trying to describe our intended function with them.
So the Bible says that whales are fish and that bats are birds, and bats might occasionally be locusts too because of the way they swarm. Who knows?
Just briefly, the word for birds there is just flying things. It's translated birds. But even if you did have some classification system where you decided the word bird meant anything that flies, then a bat would be considered in the bird category. But centuries, millennia later, we decide to construct a classification system using biological traits and not just what things do. And of course, you can't put bat in the bird kind or the bird category because it just doesn't match biologically speaking. So it's ridiculous to expect the Bible to use a Linnaean system of classification. It's horribly anachronistic. It doesn't make the Bible biologically nonsensical. It just means they're not using the classification system that we use based on the scientific method we invented just a couple centuries ago.
As the atheists like to point out, the Bible isn't a science textbook. The point of the Bible is not to tell us what exact classificatory scheme all life falls into.
Of course, now we have a way of classifying life forms by what they are, by analyzing their morphology, physiology, development, and genetics, which also allows that evolution can be traced, so that things can be classified by their ancestry indicated in the genome. We see this demonstrated with the molecular phylogeny of living primates, a computer-generated cladogram based on analysis of multiple types of genetic markers, which confirms our familial relationship as one of the great apes.
So, I think it's pretty clear from this video, Aron Ra's preferred method of classification is phylogenetics. And essentially what this boils down to is grouping living things in a groups within groups pattern called the nested hierarchy based on, as he said, their morphology and, in other cases, molecular data as well.
It's interesting to me that Aron Ra basically just takes that phylogeny and just puts it here, and he's like, boom, proof that we evolved from apes. Or, I mean, he doesn't even attempt to make the underlying argument here, which is, similarity in the genome is evidence of common ancestry, right? He doesn't even try to go into that argument. He's just like, chart, humans evolved from animals, right? I mean, he's not even, so we can make his argument for him. His argument is, right, that over time, organisms obtain mutations in their genome, and it is unlikely that any organism is going to get a particular change in its genome in a particular place. And thus, if you look at patterns of where organisms share these mutations, you can build a tree. Well, we know this is true in the case of, for example, pedigrees. We can use mutations to analyze how closely people are related in DNA studies and things like that. The problem is that at some point, there are similarities between everything that lives, because everything has the same genetic code. They have many of the same genes. And as a result, it appears that there is this aspect of shared design, that God made lots of these organisms to share these things. And what we're calling mutations may not actually be mutations in many cases. They may be places where God intentionally made a gene in a particular way. And we are now simply misclassifying it as a mutation when it wasn't actually originally.
Genomic research consistently reveals evolutionary patterns throughout zoology. For example, I made a 2-part video series on the evolution of cats and another one on the evolution of dogs, in which I referenced a number of chemically constructed cladograms, including a massive collaborative analysis of the molecular phylogeny of Carnivora. This used 2 different types of genetic analysis to confirm that cats are definitely related to meerkats, bearcats, and polecats, as well as dogs, bears, seals, weasels, hyenas, and so on.
Now, that's not actually what a phylogeny like this demonstrates. That's what you're assuming to build a phylogeny, right? When you make a phylogeny, you're assuming that everything you're looking at is related, and therefore they're all going to be on the same evolutionary tree. So you're actually making the assumption, you're not proving something. Now, furthermore, what does this actually demonstrate? It demonstrates that there is a real inherent pattern to life. In other words, God just didn't make creatures at random. Creatures have similarities to each other. They have similarities to other members of a group, and that group has similarities to members of outgroups. So what phylogenies actually show is that God made creation to be very complex in its pattern, that there are all these interesting connections between all of these different created kinds. But the existence of a phylogeny does not prove evolution, it assumes it.
And all the similarities you're talking about are going to have to be encoded in the genome as well. So when we look at the DNA, similarities are going to be every feature you have is in your DNA somewhere. And so if 2 creatures are going to have similar features, and God wanted them to have similar features, he didn't just create them with similar bone structures or biological features, but it's also going to show up in the genome as well. So the phylogeny is going to reflect a God who's creating all of life with both unity and diversity at the same time. So it's one of the ways that we look at creation and actually learn something about our creator, because we don't worship a God who creates things at random or just a bunch of disordered ways. He created things in a very ordered way, in a very structured way, and in a way that we can look at and recognize patterns, and it all kind of leads back to him. So it's one of the beautiful things that comes with being a believer and studying things like biology.
Mm-hmm. The fact that life shares a common universal genetic code, I think, can be used to point out that it does come from a common source, except that common source is actually God. He designed things and as a result used a common code to create all these different sorts of living creatures.
But it gets worse. Genomic research also shows periods of population reduction, with measured mutation rates to indicate when. These are consistent enough that comparative genomics of different populations shows that about 12,000 years ago, some unidentified cataclysm wiped out about 3/4 of most large mammals. This is not concordant with the flood, either in timing or effect. Some species went extinct, some came through all right, but cheetahs barely survived, meaning that so few of them made it through that there was a population bottleneck, causing a loss of genetic diversity. This left cheetah DNA with the deficiency of being effectively inbred. But that was 12,000 years ago, thousands of years before the world existed, according to young earth science deniers, and cheetahs are still suffering this effect. Now, if there was a global flood, it wouldn't just be cheetahs. Every terrestrial vertebrate would be similarly deficient.
All right, so bottlenecking, we talked a lot about this with our ecology class. Bottlenecking is an event where a species is rapidly declines when there's a few left, and then when you get down to a few left, it's really difficult to recover because you have a lot of loss of genetic information. Now, one thing he leaves out is that a lot of creatures go through bottlenecking events and they do recover, and that's how you get a bottleneck, because you have, right, it's not going to be half a bottleneck. If you think of a bottleneck shape, that's what it looks like when you chart out what happens. That's why they call it a bottleneck. So a lot of species do recover. And he's kind of implying here that the flood, by reducing every kind down to 2, every creature is going to get a bottlenecking event. But the example he gives is not of a created kind being reduced to 2. It is a single species being reduced to a handful of creatures. Now, a lot of scientists do believe that cheetahs are kind of doomed to extinction, sadly, because there's not enough genetic information. And that does happen. But it happens with an individual species that doesn't have enough genetic potential to diversify further. It doesn't happen to an entire created kind such that we believe in Noah's Ark. So again, the mistake he's making he's not wrong about bottlenecking events, but he's incorrect in applying it to the ark, because the ark is taking 2 of every kind with plenty of genetic potential, rather than 2 of a species that is already diversified and is already adapted and already has less genetic information than it used to. Mm-hmm. So he's just misapplying a bottlenecking event to the flood, when it happens in nature, but the flood is going to be categorically a different thing than what's unfortunately happening to the cheetahs today.
And the existence of bottlenecks is something that's actually kind of pretty fundamental to evolutionary theory. I mean, for example, one of the best examples I can think of is lemurs, right? So all lemurs live on Madagascar, and Madagascar has never been connected to the coast of Africa during the time during which lemurs would have populated it. So ideas range from like a single pregnant female rafting to Madagascar to like a couple individuals. So even evolutionists are arguing that these tiny little populations can over time give rise to huge populations with lots of diversity. There's tons of different lemur species alive today, and they all seem to probably come from a couple individuals who rafted to Madagascar. So the issue here is really the time frame and his objection that animals can't change fast enough.
It's not like creationists are ever going to admit that anything ever proves them wrong, because everything does, and they've already made public statements to the effect that they don't care what the truth is. They're going to close their eyes to that and make believe whatever they want to believe. So what they did was adapt Linnaean taxonomy into a bogus pseudoscience called baraminology. This holds that normal taxonomic hierarchies of evolution are correct, and thus the phylogenetic tree of life is correct, but only to a point. After which they say that everything comes down to an estimated 1,400 original kinds from which everything else is derived. But they will not disclose where that point is. It used to be the species level until they found out that speciation happens. Ken Ham of Answers in Genesis admits that he arbitrarily moves that point around such that it is usually the species level, but sometimes he'll push it back to the family level, ignoring the fact that humans are still in the family of apes, which he's already said he will never admit despite any amount of proof to the contrary.
One of my biggest problems with Aron Ra is that he does not expend even the most minimal amount of effort to understand what he is trying to debunk, which you would think you would want to do a little bit of research at least, but no, he just simply hasn't done any. Aron Ra, I think, is kind of disingenuous because he makes these big, bold claims about how creationists have lied about this and they've lied about that, and they've never even mentioned this, and they don't even know about this. And yet he has never, it seems, ever even taken a single glimpse at a creationist journal. Like, if he had spent 5 minutes researching for this video, he would have known what he's saying is false. Creationists have this secret cutoff for kinds, but they don't want to tell anybody. Like, what in the world? Creationists say that the cutoff for kinds is often around the family level because that's what we find in baraminological analyses. Okay, so when we take the data sets that he uses to make those branching trees and we analyze them using statistics to look for clusters, we can find clusters of organisms. And it turns out that lots of different organisms form neat clusters around the family level, which is why creationists have argued that families are often the level of the created kind. But once again, going back to the original creation, God created different numbers of different populations. So we would expect the humankind, for example, because it only had 2 original progenitors, to be smaller in its diversity than other kinds, meaning that it shouldn't be at the family level. In other words, there's no universal taxonomic level because taxonomic levels aren't real in the first place, right? Linnaeus made them up in the 1700s. So no, we wouldn't expect all the animals to line up with some random taxonomic level that some guy in the 1700s made thousands of years after God made all of the living organisms. There's just so many levels at which this is so dumb and stupid, and Aron Ra needs to just do minimal amounts of research to be competent.
Like, I think that between the 3 of us, we could make a better How Zoology Disproves Noah's Flood than Aron Ra can.
Yes. We certainly could.
This is critical. If evolution from common ancestry is not true, and some flavor of special creation of as yet unidentified kinds is true, then there would be some surface levels in a cladogram where you would accept an actual evolutionary ancestry, but there must also be subsequent levels in that twin-nested hierarchy where life forms would no longer be the same kind and wouldn't be biologically related anymore. At that point, they would be magically created separate kinds and distinctly unique from those listed around it, as well as those apparently ancestral to it. So creationists have to show at least a handful of these Baramins and show how we can distinguish them from their parent categories. This is the phylogeny challenge, the most damning argument there is against creationism, and no creationist can meet that challenge because they know this mystic boundary they allude to isn't really there.
I'm so glad that's the most damning argument against us.
Oh,
I'm so glad.
We want several examples, so why don't we each provide an example of a kind where we know the cutoff?
Okay.
I guess my example, because I'm interested in humans, would be the human kind. And basically, the pretty clear cutoff is the genus Homo. All the members of the genus Homo are related to each other, and they're unrelated to Australopithecines. And I can link some studies in the description, unlike Aron Ra, to support that. Right. You want to give an example?
I'll take the layup because he's brought this up a couple of times, but just the bear kind, all bears.
Since I'm kind of leaning more the paleontology direction, I'm going to go with the Dromaeosaur / Troodontid created kind, which seems to also include Archaeopteryx. If there's a little bit of debate about that, but if Archaeopteryx is not a part of this kind, it seems to be a member of its own created kind. But regardless, we seem to be able to clearly delineate these animals, despite sharing traits with birds and other dinosaurs, as their own created kind.
So generally, I think what we've seen here is that Aron Ra is very unfamiliar with the work that he's trying to critique. And as a result of that, he makes a lot of mistakes in his work. He conflates timelines. He doesn't really know what creationists are arguing, and that makes his arguments against Noah's flood very weak. So let's kind of go to some general points about the video. Why don't you start, Jake? What did you think of the video, in summary?
Well, I agree with you. I'd say ultimate takeaway is Aron Ra is not super familiar or familiar at all with the basic creation model. And this is creationism has gone through a lot of changes, and there's been a lot of models we've thrown out, and there's been a lot of bad research done. There's been a lot of good research done. I mean, creationism, it hasn't been around for super long, but it has gone through a lot of changes and throwing out old theories. But what's crazy is some of the things that Aron Ra gets mixed up with, or some of the accusations he's made. These are things that we've had answers for, like from the beginning, from the beginning of really any creation model. So it's not like it's not even that he's outdated. It's just that he's challenging us on things we've had answers for a long time. And again, as someone who's relatively educated in zoology, that's just a huge one. Just repeatedly, even in cases where it's not so obvious, he's repeatedly conflating a kind with a species. He's assuming that most creationists believe that the cutoff point is a species, which is ridiculous. Again, bringing up the bottlenecking argument for cheetahs, which is an interesting thing. Like I read up on that. It's bottlenecking events are fascinating, but to then say that bottlenecking events is an argument against the flood. Again, the animals that are on the flood were not broken up by species; it was broken up by kinds. So even he made that mistake from the beginning, but even throughout the video, when he's bringing up certain examples, it's very obvious to see conflating kind with a species, which is, I could have made a counter argument to that where I was just getting into reading creation books when I was in middle school. I could have said, no, that's the kind and a species are not the same thing. So my ultimate takeaway is, number one, that I completely agree with you. He is not well read on the creation literature. And number two, the frequent conflations with species and kind it's not even something that it's of no value. It's not even something we can critique. It's just downright wrong.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Christian?
Well, personally, I think Aron Ra did an excellent job at debunking his own personal flood model. Maybe not our flood model, but which the flood model of his own creation. What really bothers me about this video and the others in this fill in the blank disproves Noah's flood series is Aron Ra spends a great deal of time lunging ad hominems and insults rather than actual meaty arguments, which to me, obviously, I don't know what's going on in his head, but it doesn't read to me like a genuine attempt to actually critique young earth creationism. These types of videos are not helpful to me at all because one, like half of it's wrong, the other half's just insults. I have seen far better critiques of young earth creationism on YouTube. I just saw another one the other day. There's a YouTube channel called Clint's Reptiles. Now, he's obviously not a young earth creationist, but he's done a couple of videos recently where he responds to young earth creationist videos, and throughout them, he makes a point to steelman the young earth creationist position. He actually has a definition of created kind in the video, which Aron Ra somehow couldn't cobble together from any of our resources. And Clint spends a lot of time talking to young earth creationists in his personal life in order to actually understand our position so that he doesn't straw man us. And that leads to a more fruitful discussion, I think. I mean, you can compare Clint's video to this garbage we just watched. I found Clint's video refreshing. I don't agree with all aspects of it, but it was a refreshing watch. And Aron Ra's video kind of just makes me want to yank my hair out.
It's disappointing because, I start to roll my eyes now when people say things like straw man and ad hominem because they're just such overused terms now. It's anytime someone there's an argument against you, people just say, "Oh, well, it's a straw man fallacy." They don't even know what it means. So it's always disappointing to encounter something that like does fit the description, and it's so overused. But I didn't say it at all in this review, but like it really is a straw man because he's putting together a flood model. He's using his own timeline. He's using definitions that don't exist, or he's misdefining the word kind. So I've said this before, like when there's two sides of an issue, both sides tend to get to define their own terms. So like we should use the evolutionist definition of like natural selection. That's a term they made. That's a term they use. We should use their term. But what's crazy to me, and it happens much more on the evolutionist side, is that we'll have plenty of terms and they'll take our terms and define them the way they want to. And it's like, no, we use your definitions for plenty of things. But when we come up with something, we have something on our end, you have to use the definition the way we made the definition, because that's, that word belongs to us in a sense. You can almost have this word war with definitions, but it's really true. You do have to, in any debate, one side will get their definitions, one side gets their definitions, and you can't take their word and make it into whatever you want, because otherwise you're not actually arguing on topic and on what the debate is actually about. You're just beating a straw man to death. You're not beating their argument. You're beating nothing. It's something that no one's ever said, no one's ever argued for.
Yeah.
Again, that's my second concluding remark. That's my takeaway here.
This video is like exhibit 1 of why I don't watch Aron Ra. Like, I watch some atheist YouTubers or evolutionist YouTubers with some regularity, and that's because they actually have something interesting or decent to say. Aron Ra and a few other people I just never watch because they don't ever have anything useful to contribute. And as Christian mentioned, their videos are just full of ad hominem. So there's really no reason for me to watch it. If he had come up with an actual problem with creationism in this video, I would be the first one to admit that it was actually a problem and that we don't yet have a way to address it.
Yeah.
And I kind of mentioned that already in this video about like diversification. We don't yet know exactly how organisms change very rapidly. But he has failed to bring up anything that I could really even consider as a huge problem with creationism in this video. And that just shows how far he is from missing the mark that any of us would be willing to recognize if he made a point. And he just like missed the mark by a million miles. So if you, unlike Aron Ra, would actually like to be educated in what creationists argue, then I think we have a suggestion for you. We happen to have a whole YouTube channel, which you are probably already aware of because you're watching it for the last like several hours. And furthermore, we actually have a blog. So you can go check us out online at newcreation.blog if you'd like to learn more about young Earth creationists and what we actually say. So this has been us reacting to Aron Ra. Thank you so much for watching. And thank you to Jake and Christian for joining me.